Welcome back to the show. As the United States continues to accuse Russia of interfering in its recent presidential election, we're also talking about the history of U.S. intervention in other countries' elections and political affairs. Let's get back to our panel. And Peter, we were talking there about the 1996 Russian election, Boris Yeltsin retaining power. Was the U.S. involvement in that?
The U.S. was very much involved in Russian affairs throughout the 1990s, and they've tried to be ever since also. The American advisors came in there after the end of the Soviet Union and really set up this shock therapy for the Russian economy. Yeltsin was very pliable, very willing to work with the Americans, very willing to accept the advice of American economic advisors. This is Stephen Sachs and the folks from Harvard and then Columbia. And so they basically gutted the Russian economy during that period. So the U.S. was very involved in those elections. And the U.S. has, as we were saying, been involved in elections all over the world. The United States handled it some ways differently than Russia in its sphere of influence, but both sides have been involved. That's part of what's so sad about what's happening now, is we're reverting back to the worst days of the Cold War. The tensions between the United States and Russia are at a fever pitch right now. The threat of war between our countries is closer than it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've got these crises, these conflicts in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe. We've got, the situation around the world in Syria is very, very tense. And so this kind of unmitigated attack on Russia for these hacks now is just making the tensions even worse. It's ironic in a sense that Trump coming in here might actually ease the tensions. And when I was in Russia several times this year, and my Russian colleagues were overwhelmingly in favor of Trump. The one place where I got the opposite reaction was when I spoke at MGIMO in Moscow, and that's the university that trains the diplomats. And they were actually overwhelmingly in favor of Clinton, because in their minds, like mine, you had to choose a warmonger like Clinton over a madman like Trump. And my fear is, and I assumed that Putin was too intelligent to actually support Trump, because in the short run, Trump looks good. But I think in the long run, he's going to be sorry for that he got what he wished for if he was actually supporting Trump. I think he was too smart for that. And I don't think anybody in Russia who I was talking to actually expected Trump to win, nor did the Trump people even expect Trump to win. So, but the situation is very dangerous. And that these kinds of innuendos or accusations right now are just raising the tensions in an already serious and dangerous situation.
Fred, what is your view on this? Have tensions risen to a very dangerous level now? Could we see the possibility of a cyber war becoming a hot war, a real war?
I have to say I don't see it that way. And I might note that after President Obama kicked out those Russian diplomats, the Russians didn't reciprocate. The Russians laughed at the president. And I think the reason is that this president, I regret to say, doesn't have much credibility left on the international stage. He's had a policy of leading from behind. He's had a policy of retreat. And the Russians weren't offended. They're just ignoring Mr. Obama, waiting for the next president. What I'm hoping is that President Trump will have a policy that will address the threat from Russia and find a way to cooperate with Russia. I don't know what the purpose is of Obama policy. The U.S. is not going to sanction the Russians to get out of Ukraine and Crimea. There has to be another approach. There has to be a mix of incentives and, frankly, pressure to get the Russians to work in a way that would be cooperative and not destabilizing.
Ambassador, we talked about the U.S. involvement in Latin America, especially in the 80s. What is the situation right now? Is the U.S. still involved in Latin America, or is it a bit more difficult to see right now?
Yes, the U.S. is still involved in Latin America. There have been denunciations by President Evo Morales in Bolivia, by President Correa in Ecuador, by President Maduro in Venezuela, that U.S. diplomats, U.S. agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development carry on programs that are definitely actively promoting instability, promoting the opposition. In the case of Cuba, it's very peculiar because we are right now in a process of normalization, and President Obama has ordered all government institutions with his presidential directive of October last year to cooperate with their Cuban counterparts. Now, it's very interesting because, for example, on the issue of drug trafficking, it is obviously drug trafficking is a security issue in the United States. It's a security issue in Cuba, and the two security services are cooperating against drug trafficking. There has not been, that cooperation has not been expanded to other areas, although there is the desire, especially in the United States. I think it's a way of exercising influence inside the Cuban political system, a political system that has proven a resiliency that is kind of difficult for the United States to understand. So I think that it continues to happen, but that in Latin America we are more ready to resist it and neutralize it than before.
Alexander, to Peter's point about whether the Russian leadership had a preference for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, what do you make of that? Did President Putin have a preference?
Well, first of all, in the Kremlin, they were quite pragmatic about Trump. Now, Trump, on the one hand, was saying things like that Russia had to intervene in Ukraine, that Crimea should be seen as Russian, and in Syria, that Russia was playing a positive role. But on the other hand, he was making quite threatening statements when he was saying that the American military is weak, it needs to be built up, it needs to be more powerful. He was saying quite aggressive things as well. So I agree with this point that on the surface, Trump was looking as a better choice for the Kremlin. But generally speaking, he, in the long run, he might cause quite a lot of trouble for Russia. So I don't think that the Kremlin was actually saying, yeah, we like Trump, we don't like Hillary, and let's support Trump. I think that this perception that Putin was sitting there in the Kremlin, as it is now being presented, with his security chiefs, and saying to them, look, guys, we need to really support Trump. How can we do that? That doesn't work like that in the Kremlin. And, it's just, coming from some sort of a fictional novel, Tom Clancy novel. It doesn't work like that. There's a completely different perception of what is going on. There are different groups, which one group might say that, Hillary is better for us, and another group will say that Trump is better for us. But it doesn't mean that, that the decision is made, let's support that candidate.
Okay. Fred, very quickly, I've got 30 seconds. Will we see these current tensions be lowered? Will we see this being resolved in the near future?
I think they're going to be lowered under a Trump administration. I still think there's going to be tension, but I'm very optimistic that with Secretary of State Tillerson and Mr. Trump and his team, there's going to be an improvement.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us.